I would challenge you to try to pronounce my last name too. You do not get away always by just saying President Kersti. Try the last name. Try.
I do this with all the presidents. Okay.
Try.
I'll do the challenge if you do my challenge. You got to pronounce my last name.
Okay.
Okay.
Yours.
So,
how do you write it?
Okay. I should write it down somewhere. Yours is Kersti. Oh my lord. Kaljulaid.
Kaljulaid. Almost
Kaljulaid.
there. Yeah, almost there. Okay, fire off your questions now. Well done. I give you 4 on that pronunciation.
Okay, here we go. Rapid fire question. Ben says, what was your favorite part about yesterday?
Morning.
The morning.
Morning is always my favorite part of the day.
Sander says, what's your purpose for this year?
To achieve that Europe is in a better place than it fell into 24th of February, the national holiday of Estonia, which unfortunately now forever will be remembered as the day when war started in Europe.
That's a powerful purpose. Anna says, what can the government do immediately to save nature and planet?
Remove obstacles from private sector and take push for greenery and make sure that they do not change their promise that they want to go green, that the political objective is clear and that they will never walk back.
Yes, it's very good. Flora says, what's the nicest country you've traveled to?
I cannot answer that because I've traveled to so many, and when Estonia was running for Security Council of UN, I met wonderful people in wonderful places. Every place is worth revisiting. That is what I will do when I've retired.
All right, good diplomatic answer. Chris, now I don't know if you're going to answer this one then. Chris says, which foreign politician was the nicest one?
We don't gossip about each other.
Anu says, do you miss being the president of Estonia?
No, because only the big speeches are missing. I get to do the rest still. I mean, speeches, meeting people, teaching at schools, going to universities, giving lectures, doing conferences. All this is still there in my life. So, yeah, no, I don't. We have a wonderful successor, Alar Karis. He's a great president.
Fantastic. Baiba says, did you experience discrimination as a president?
Yes, it happens very often, and not only as presidents, but also prime ministers, all women in high posts sometimes exit the plane and see the eyes lost looking behind you. Who is the VIP here? Wow. This is quite common, and I think most women have seen it.
Yeah. Gabriela says, what do you do in your free time?
No free time. Family, sports.
And final question, Josephine says, what's the next big thing about Estonia?
I think the next big thing about Estonia is the same, which has been the big thing for us for 20 years, but it just upscales. It's now 10 unicorns per million, yes. But we want to get the ICT in Estonian GDP from 3 to 30% in 10 years' time. This is a rapid expansion, so we do, but this doesn't mean we do more the same. It's always the different stuff. It's now proliferation in all sectors of economy. I mean, trying to disrupt all sectors of economy. Also, for example, green sectors, where energy sectors, with more and more this kind of startup culture. And it's going very well, I have to say. Super.
Well, President, thank you for being here. And with that, you now are going to switch into the role of being moderator.
Yes.
And so I'm going to leave the stage to you. We're going to keep this app open, and if there's time at the end of the panel, then we'll take questions from you. But with that, the stage is yours.
Thank you. I would really like to invite now Johnny Hugill, who represents the public team, who is head of research there. And public team is backing and building GovTech startups to transform European governments. Johnny, I'm so sorry you have so tough task. It's a tough job to help to transform European governments, but please come on and please give him a warm welcome. And I hope we have also Luukas Ilves coming in. I don't know whether he's okay. Luukas, please do come on as well. Luukas is a CTO of Estonia. Many of you may know Siim Sikkut. Luukas took over from Siim now, and he I think has an easier job, because in Estonia you just need to do better e-government, whereas elsewhere in Europe you have to simply do e-government. and if we will be we have Audrey. Welcome, Audrey, the digital minister of Taiwan, joining us here. Wonderful to see you. And I really hope that we can have, therefore, coming from 3 different corners of this world, a really good discussion on data, public sector governance. It's called Public Data Exchange Panel. Welcome all. So, I would go straight into the first question, which for me seems very obvious, you know. Before you can start discussing using the data of your citizens and people, you must really be convinced that they want to share their data with you. So it is obvious you must somehow convince people that it is safe. And even before we therefore get to this discussion of how it could be personally rewarding, how to do this? I mean, I would maybe start with Luukas, since I said he has an easier job. We're all familiar with the Estonian model, but this model rather applies to the first generation e-services, not database approach of offering proactive government services. How to earn the trust of Estonians now for that next level, where your service provision will depend on your own data, which the government has in its databases. Please, Luukas, let us know.
Well, the tough part of my job can probably be summed up by the phrase, don't screw it up. Which is to say, expectations are high. If I don't come up with the next big thing, then and Kersti and others are going to be saying in a few years' time how it's all my fault. And that also applies to trust, right? I mean, the asset that we have is a very high trust of users, of citizens, and how we use data. It's about 96, 95% when we measure it. But the downside is that we can screw it up and we can lose that trust. And so we're always aware of that risk. So what we're doing today is, first of all, we're trying to do some of the things we've done for a while more consistently. So tracking the availability and tracking the usage of data, something we've done in some services, but we have to do it across the board so that citizens really have that transparency. And we have to make it machine readable. So it's not just citizens logging onto a portal, but they can follow it in apps, in services that make your data trackable. So I think on the personal sharing of data, the first thing is to really make those tools that make data tracking, that make reuse of your personal data transparent, universal. And the second thing is that transparency isn't just technological. Transparency is cultural. And so it's ultimately the confidence that people in Estonia have that when the government screws up, they'll be honest about it. And we've made mistakes, we've had incidents, we've had security flaws. There's no such thing as invulnerable technology, but we also have the habit of, when that happens, going out and stating so publicly. And so that creates a human confidence and trust that even when the systems fail, the underlying societal system is still going to work.
Well, this is fantastic how you are going to advance and support Estonians in their data usage, but I have to ask before I turn to Audrey, you are next to propose how you actually develop your data-driven service and how do you convince your people to be ready to participate. But I will give you a minute to think about it because I want to ask Luukas a follow-up. How do you explain this e-governance 2.0 to your grandmother? And how can the grandmother manage opt-ins, opt-outs? And exactly how can they keep track and overview?
Yep.
You have a minute to explain it because my grandmother is an impatient person.
I'll be very honest. We don't know yet. We're having that discussion right now around opening up government data to the private sector. And the discussion we're basically having is how thick should the policy layer of control be precisely to protect the grandmothers, right? Because the upside, and we're doing this now, is you get to share the data with a bank, with the credit rating agency, with an insurer, with a mobility as a service company, and you get a great service, you get a better deal. The downside is someone unscrupulous comes and says, click this button, give us your data, and the grandmother's not going to know what's going on, not going to control it. And so the discussion we're having right now is how much does the government come in and basically make that a difficult opt-in, put barriers? We don't have a clear answer. And I think we need to have that discussion with the startups who can talk about design, who can talk precisely about this question of how we communicate that well to people.
Yes, because, you know, my oldest son is a data protection geek, and I think he spends his whole life in managing and handling, even in the current system, how exactly his data in government files is used. If I look this list, which I see on the screen, I give up immediately because it's just too tough to, follow on, and then ask, what's going on? Because getting one vaccination done may result in 10 checks on my data, and this is not manageable. Now, Audrey, where are you then with data-driven service proposal, and how do you convince your people?
I don't work for the people, I work with the people. I don't work for the government, I work with the government. I come from this civic technology community named G0V or Gov0, where we systematically look at all the government digital services that end in something .gov.tw and fork it into something .g0v.tw. So for all the digital services that the government provides that has a shortcoming or doesn't provide, the citizens are free to invent their own way of data collection, processing, and delivery. All we're asking is an open protocol so that when the Gov0 people do that, it must be open source also and in the Creative Commons. So when the public service in each municipality and so on want to merge it back, it's always a soft fork. And we did that for the distribution of masks, for the distribution of rapid tests, did that for contact tracing, venue-based QR code, and so on. They're not GovTech, they're civic tech. It's just the government's contact tracers have an auditable use of the contact tracing developed by the civil society.
So what is your feedback mechanism then to the people on how they can verify that what you have promised you are delivering and that you are not doing with the information they have, the things they don't want you to do?
Yeah, for example, in Taiwan, you're free to use any EMR services to deliver the healthcare and so on, as long as they speak the same protocol that talks with the IC card as our national health card. My grandma, almost 90 years old, knows exactly what does that IC card entails. It means that she has the full access to the ledger of the clinician, dentist, traditional medicine visits, and so on, and she can hold the doctors to account if things go wrong, and she can assign a delegate who acts on her behalf to look at those records for her. And we also have a virtualized QR code-based national health card that does the same thing. And so the social norm around the use of such IC card-based identities is implied there, that it will not go to the advertisers or any commercial uses, will be reserved for the health-related uses and the ones approved by the Administration for National Healthcare. And so it's through mutual accountability and a very direct feedback cycle. You can't just pick up a toll-free number and call 1922 and say, I think the data is wrong, I think the diagnosis is wrong, and so on, and meet with a real person over the other side of the telephone who will look at the data history for you.
Let's try to make it even clearer. Let's imagine there is a leak. Somebody realizes that something of their data must be out there because, let's say, they are kept getting unwanted advertisement. Let's take an easy case. It's not published, somebody bothers people data online, but just, they are getting advertisement which they think is related to a data link. Who is responsible to do what to whom now? Is it the person himself or herself who has to turn to authorities, go to the court, or is the government taking that responsibility for people then?
In the Taiwan case, each ministry is its own data protection authority. So depending on which side did you get the advertisement from, was it trying to sell you new treatments? Was it trying to sell you new communication devices and things like that? That particular minister will be able to respond to that.
Thank you. I think we understand now far better how in Taiwan this works and why Taiwanese people are ready to trust the government with data. Johnny, the same question to you. As I said, you operate in far more difficult operational setting, trying to convince European governments to buy into private sector startup service development for e-services. How does that link into the trust issue?
Yeah, It's been really interesting because I've met a lot of Estonians over the past few days, and they're extremely modest and humble. But the one thing they're not really modest and humble about is e-government, because they're really proud, and rightly so. They have. I think it's worth kind of reflecting here some of the things that are really taken for granted, like having a single ID for government services, having a ledger of all of your transactions. A lot of the things we've spoken about in Estonia and Taiwan, we actually don't have in the UK. And in fact, if you think about governments like France and Germany, Belgium, countries that by all other measures you'd sort of expect to have that kind of level of efficiency of government, is not there yet. And I've been trying to kind of think why that is and why there's a disconnect, because by many stretches, the UK actually has one of the best government digital services in the world, indeed one of the first, and has set a lot of the standards for a lot of the great work that's been done in Taiwan and Estonia and in lots of places. I do think there are some really interesting structural, like cultural challenges about data sharing in the UK that seem to me not so serious here. So Luukas mentioned that 95, 96% of people are happy with government data sharing. When we've measured that in the UK, it's around 50%. And the really challenging thing is that people are demanding the quality of services that you get from better data sharing, automated services, getting alerts, personalization, but they're not comfortable with what you need to do, which is sharing data. The other thing that's been really interesting is the way that you frame that question. So people are comfortable sharing, people are very comfortable with, for instance, the government auto-filling forms that they may have previously filled out. But people don't kind of think about that as a data sharing or in a data storing question, but of course it is. So I think conceptually people are worried about data sharing, but then in practice, especially with some of those kind of very simple use cases, people are comfortable with it. I think my perspective is, I think the UK and governments like it who kind of are starting from a further back place really have to think about the key case studies. And that's what I think Singapore have done really well. So Singapore have built an app called Life SG. And for all the most important things that you might do, where you might want joined up services, like if you have childbirth and you need to alert your local authority, or you need to change your benefit system after you've had a child, that's all in one place. I think that's what the UK needs to do, is they need to think about the sort of 3 or 4 most important transactions where data sharing is required and nail those first before tackling the bigger.
But then I have a follow-on question to you. If you look from afar, it seems like NHS, your National Health Service, is at the forefront of experimenting and trying to bring in AI elements into service provision, like, for example, initial sorting of, into which queue you should go, immediate help to wait half an hour, half a year, this kind of sorting thing. And there are more and more this kind of devices. How exactly have you told then to UK people what kind of data are these AI systems using to train and teach themselves? Are you lying to your people saying that we train them somewhere else, not on your data?
Yeah.
I think people would not believe it because they realize then it will not actually relate in the UK system. So you must actually be doing kind of data gathering, analyzing, and using it then for AI learning, at least in NHS. How does it work?
You're totally, that's the other quite interesting thing about the UK, is that some of these basic services we don't do as well, but we do actually do some of the real cutting edge experimentation and testing and regulatory pressure better than almost anyone else. So we have an NHS AI lab that spends hundreds of millions of pounds a year on testing cutting edge applications of AI in healthcare. That's something most governments don't have, honestly. The question of how do people feel about their data in those kind of settings, it's still this, we have the same problem. So the biggest barrier to some of these things is always people uncomfortable with at-scale aggregated use of data on health outcomes. So the UK released longitudinal cancer data over a 10-15 year period about cancer health outcomes, treatment types, and it's been an amazing advance in cancer treatment in the UK and internationally, but the big blocker was people uncomfortable with releasing it. So it's a challenge.
So you haven't been able to drive through the message to your people that you are getting all these fantastic services because our AI is learning based on what you have told us previously, in your telephone calls, in filling out the checklists and everything. So this link is missing in the collective brain of UK citizens.
I think so. I think my final point is probably one thing that people sometimes underestimate about building trust in digital services is that they just work and they look really professional. Both the quality of them, but also the UX and front end of them. when you engage with a service in the private sector, you trust it if it feels and looks better, right? And one of the places I think we've fallen down a lot is that we have built, over the years, confusing services, services that take people in lots of different places, services that don't always look as good as they should or feel as good as they should. And it's just such a structural barrier to building trust in digital services. So I think something Taiwan and Estonia have done better is with some of those key transactional basic services. They just work well, and they look great, and they feel great, and they feel like an app you might use in the private sector. And that's kind of what we need to do.
But we're also trying to have in this country a public debate leading obviously to a kind of common agreement on e-government 2.0. I think Luukas might want to discuss this further, but our initial promise to our people was on data was once only. We don't ask you again if government has to know it, and we do not use this data in an aggregated form, to make any predictions about you. The second principle is more now under the cushion if you want to turn proactive, because in fact you will have to aggregate data and you will have to offer people events-based services.
Yeah.
I mean, how then to, I think this is the question to all three of you, how now to, rise with this public, trust to this kind of 2.0 level. I think I will let Luukas to start, because for us this problem is immediate. Then Audrey, you could follow. I don't know where you are with proactive service provision, and then you could come next. Thank you.
So there are two elements to this question of proactive services. The first bit is data sharing within government. And I think that is, in our case, a debate and a discussion we can have, and there will probably have to be opt-outs, but I think that many Estonians will be comfortable with the idea that we can cross-reference data in a benign way in order to provide people a better service. But the value that we get from data, if we look at the title of this panel, is ultimately not just about the government holding on to its data and government-only services. It's when data flows in and out of government, and when both individual people's data as well as aggregate data can be used by private parties. Whether that's the genomic data that Estonians have and turning that into something that powers the next generation of healthcare interventions across the world and saves, I would hope, millions of lives across the world, and also brings economic benefits, or whether that's, for instance, some of the services the Accelerate Estonia program is working on. We've brought in private sector companies, for instance, to have a whole new flow of data for copyright, a whole new flow of data for how we pay for training and education in this country. And that's really tricky, because that's when sort of the trust in the government isn't enough. You have a combination of trust in government and the private sector parties. Sometimes those are private sector parties where you as a consumer might be working with them. Sometimes it might be a third party if we're talking about anonymized aggregated data. And what we know from trust in the private sector is that users are fairly quick to build initial trust in the private sector. I don't think many of us fundamentally distrusted Facebook in 2006 or 7 when we started using it. That is rather something that gets lost. And the thing that we as governments have to, Audrey is shaking, is having your head shaking a bit, but of course you were an unusual user and a very tech-aware user back in 2005 or 6 when it came to Facebook. The vast majority didn't think about that, I think. And so the risk for government is that when we start sharing data outside of that periphery with parties that don't have the accountability that we have, how do we manage our risk there? Some of that is a formal question. It's a transparency question that will help solve it, but it's also going to have to be a communications and a design question. There's one last bit I do want to throw in, which is I think AI can help. You talked about the cognitive difficulty of looking through everything that's happening with your data and understanding the log files. That's a problem we have now in Estonia when some of the data access is made transparent. When we truly make every use of data fully transparent, you'll have 1,000 log lines. You need to have an agent working on your behalf to solve that. In Estonia, we have our Bureaucrat program, where the idea is to develop AI agents that work on behalf of citizens. So that is, I think, part of the solution. I don't expect that all of these AI agents will be developed by government. I think we're rather waiting for academia, for the civ tech movement, and for companies to develop those, so that ultimately, just as the people who might be misusing your data have AI working on their behalf, we can kind of have an adversarial AI working on our behalf that's ensuring that our data is used in a way that serves our interests.
Yeah, but Luukas, let's take it again, practical level. I mean, our first proactive service was that retired people in Estonia, if they live alone, get a top-up to their pension because heating cost is high in Estonia. Nobody has anything against, therefore, AI looking through a few databases, establishing that you fall into that category and you get a top-up. You don't even have to apply, you don't even have to know about this service. But take another service which is dedicated to help young people who are not in employment, not studying, and not in any way involved in society. We have a service which detects these people and sends people from local government to offer them help. This is far more intrusive. Now, my question is, I can opt out of Facebook very easily. I really don't want to opt out of all my government services, but I might want to opt out of some services. Where is my opt-out point? Because when now already this service provider is behind my door, she or he already knows maybe more than I want them to know. So
for healthcare records, we offer that today. Mind you, you can opt out of allowing any hospital or physician to see your data. For instance, when you go to the ER, when you press that opt-out button, we ask you 3 times, are you really sure you want to opt out? So that has to be there. 2 points. First of all, I don't think there's an easy deductive answer. I think we're going to have to get our way to how we do that in an agile way. We're going to start rolling out these services, and we'll see how users react. We'll see what the public discussion is for one service, and then we'll see how we have to adjust. And the other thing is, good design is going to be really important. It's not going to be enough to have services where the geeks and the technical analysts understand what's going on and think it's transparent. We'll have to do what I think the UK has done incredibly well, which is to have very clear, plain English explanations, if it's in English, plain Estonian, plain Cantonese, etc., saying here's what's happening, here's what's good, here's what's bad, here are your choices. We'll have to have media communication. I don't have a simple sort of formula for what the balance will look like. It's going to be an iterative process. We're going to have to think about it in an agile way. We'll have alphas, we'll have betas, and we'll get our way there eventually. We don't want to go straight to something where we have a live service, massively disruptive, covering the entire population without having done that testing.
Well, Audrey, do you already have this kind of common understanding and agreement for this kind of proactive database service provision to your citizens? And how did you achieve it, if you have?
We do, but as I mentioned, in Taiwan, the norm around each different part of the government is mediated by that ministry. So I think there's a fundamental difference. Just like we don't talk about a textual norm, right? We talk about the norm of the academic published text, which is called papers, and then we talk about news, journalism, which is a different definition of rigor, and so on. I don't think there's a common data norm anymore than a common text norm. So when we digitalize any particular part of service, that particular ministry or agency look at the norm around the text-based transactions there or paper-based transaction there, and then apply the norms from the society into the kind of service that they deliver. Now, this is helped by the open API procurement strategy that we put in place in 2016, where all the websites that has an interactive part, when we procure the IT vendors, we treat robots, JSON open API speaking robots, as a kind of universal access, like people with different abilities. So just like you cannot discriminate against people with seeing difficulties, you cannot discriminate against robots, right? So when people preferring a different kind of service delivery want to fork the government, they don't have to replace the bedrock side of services, but they can provide the kind of design, the assistive intelligence, the kind of personalized AI that the service consumers want. So, for example, in visualizing the mask distribution, there's easily 100 different chatbots and maps and so on, each catering to a different kind of perspective, different kind of demand when it comes to PPE distribution in Taiwan. Later on, that would apply to rapid test, antigen test distribution. So I often like this kind of use of personalized AI as assistive intelligence, like my eyeglass, which is aligned to my vision. I don't see pop-up advertisement, but most importantly, it's accountable in a sense. If there is bias, if it's blurry, I can fix it myself. I can take it, it's open source, the schema is open source, to the person down the street to fix it. We don't have to sign an NDA or pay $3,000 in license fee.
John, you are a consultant and you heard 2 quite different approaches to this problem. How do you how do you see, should we try to aim for having kind of universal set of principles all across the public sector service provision about exactly how people could, I mean, without losing the quality of service, also control whether they want to participate or not want to participate in any particular aspect of public service provision?
It's been so interesting hearing this because it just shows again like how carefully thought through a lot of this stuff is. One of the worst, biggest kind of digital failures we've had in the UK in recent years. Big story here in the UK, maybe not such a big story here, was during COVID, people couldn't sit their exams. And so we had to figure out what we were going to do with exam scores. And with a batch of the population, we essentially predicted what their grade might be based on previous performance. And this was a huge upset. A lot of people didn't get the grade they wanted. And there was discussion about this for weeks. And I think the biggest problem was, it was a very difficult problem for government to solve and almost a problem with no solution. But the thing that they didn't do well was they didn't explain the decision-making process, they didn't explain the consultation process, and they didn't explain how the algorithm worked. And so I think my view is that if we want a sort of unifying principle, it's that we just need really, really good explainability. But then you're right, you then do need to start thinking about that on a case-by-case basis. So if we're thinking about preventative services for people who are at risk of homelessness, let's say, very sensitive space, explainability is our core principle, but for that specific case, we need to engage with people to define what the service should look like, be really clear about how we've engaged and why we've developed the approach we have, and sort of put explainability at the heart of it. So I think that's the most important thing when we're thinking about predictive and proactive services is explainability. I think it's a huge opportunity for people who want to make a big impact on digital government services is bringing this wave of explainability that we're starting to see in the private sector in the same applications, right? So just in the same way that so much time and investment is going to explainable AI for self-driving cars, explainable AI even for your Spotify algorithm, right? These are things that people are taking much more seriously in the private sector. I think we need a much, much better approach to explainability of public services. And Luukas is right, in the UK we're fantastic at content design, very clearly explaining a service with, that's what the government digital service has done so well. I think the next generation of that is taking content design and taking it into pure explainability for algorithms and AI.
Good. So we have a panel of data optimists, I believe, and we have now established that everybody here believes that trust can be built into data-driven service provision. It's possible to do. I know some out there might disagree, but we think this way, so we can move on and dream on. If people are ready to let us synthesize their data and predict their future outcomes, given we have set ourselves limits on how we use this data only for their benefit, never against people, how should they then be able to track and how can they actually benefit from this? Because it's pretty obvious that if my data happens into, let's say, a screening program where it is discovered I have a cancer risk or an early menopausal risk, I will want to know and adjust my behavior. But what if I do not want to be informed because there is a risk with a reasonable probability, but which is unmanageable? How and who makes these decisions, and what can we offer our people, I mean, in exchange of them opting into such system? What's your feeling there? And if you have opportunity to a little bit also venture into a really dangerous territory, what can we, if we are offering our people something in exchange of their participation, I don't know, free treatment, money, career breaks, opportunities to get their kids into better school. And if we are going down this way of offering, is it still free choice, or have we overstepped the line of coercion in that case? So I would start with Audrey, maybe, with this very difficult question. And Audrey, the floor is yours, please.
Taiwan has 20 national languages, including the Taiwanese Sign Language. 16 of which are indigenous, and they have overlapping jurisdiction on different parts of the lands. So we're looking at a place that really is much more transcultural than any kind of single set of norms, which is, I guess, also partly why we get to pass the marriage equality law first in Asia, simply because there's just so many matriarchal or whatever configuration of society possible. But because of that, we must, in Taiwan then, start with communities. the communities self-determine what kind of data norms they want in all the different areas of their lives. The communities using Web3 technologies, Vitalik just last week published DSOC, the Decentralized Society, which I also contributed in, at least a part of Dao De Jing was from me, that outlines a way for self-determination to work on the community, but also for digital democracy to set on the common norms, things that we can all live with across the different 20 national language community. But it always starts from the grassroots. I think that's where trustworthiness begins to build.
Thank you. I think it's very important that you brought in the cultural aspect, because what I can never stress enough is that every state is a culture, and this culture has to prevail also in your public service software when it is digital. Many people think that state-keeping culture changes automatically when you go digital. For example, corruption vanishes because everything's on the ledger. This is not the case. It will always be also the cultural issue. Johnny, how do you feel about these questions? What could, if I agreed to share, let's say, my own kind of learning patterns with government, should my child get a place in a better school? I mean, in the societies where schools quality differ and there is not so good universal education model, this might be one of the biggest incentives for me to share my data. Yeah. Let's take this example. Yeah. Should I get then a better place at school?
Yeah, I completely get the point. I think the best incentive is just better services, right? And in the same way that in Estonia have managed to drive huge amounts of uptake of use of digital services. The big incentive for that was just that services work and they make people's lives easier. So you're right, the biggest incentive we can think about is probably not tax breaks, or probably not any kind of other incentive other than just this will make your life easier. And it is worth making the distinction between some things will make your life easier because they will automatically do simple things for you that saves you time, and some will be more predictive and higher impact interventions, like you said, in healthcare or indeed in selecting a school. And those are probably the ones where I can see the most sensitivity. I think if we're thinking about incentives, so incentives for citizen uptake is just make the service as good as possible and make it, people want to use it. We have to think carefully about incentives for current government systems, for current government departments, for local governments. Take the example, in the UK, we looked at this exact problem I mentioned of how can we join up data better to solve issues around early prevention of homelessness, at-risk and vulnerable strata of the population. Basically, those services sit across 7 central government departments, every single local government. Over 200, 300 different databases and case management systems are responsible for holding that data. Obviously, lots of those are operated by private sector companies who are the data providers. And so I think that's where we really have to think carefully about the incentives, is how do we take a system like that is so complex and where incentives are so entrenched and try and, unpick that.
We're very critical about, for example, Chinese way of profiling the people, social scoring and all this. How to make sure that we do not fall ourselves into the same trap in democratic societies, because after all it is really easy to imagine that you look at where somebody lives, what is their parents' income, you could profile them pretty well, and you could try to slightly turn their life choices in order to make sure they don't go down the bad way. What should be the democratic governance setup to limit this kind of action, that we base our opinion and our action on profiling? How do you plan to go about that?
Luukas, you want to try that one?
No.
Well, I want to take issue with something that Kersti and Audrey have talked about, which is, I think, within, say, Estonia, low power distance country, everyone can come talk to the current and the ex-president and use, speak to them on a first name basis. Just not that many people. These are solvable issues. They're difficult, but they're solvable. But we're at a startup conference. None of you want to build services that work in Estonia. You want to build services that scale globally. So the challenge is, how do we solve the cultural issue of, do I trust a German service, a Taiwanese service, an American or a British service that is accessing these APIs, accessing this data? And I think think that's a really tough thing to address, because if we're going to build GovTech, if we're going to have this interoperability between public and private, it's going to involve those boundaries. I think part of it's going to involve also saying there are some political lines we draw, so that, the easy thing mentally for us to say, are you GDPR compliant in the EU? I would like for that umbrella of countries and companies we trust to include the UK, to include Taiwan, even, God willing, to include the US if we can conclude the right agreements around data protection. It's probably not going to include communist China or Russia in the near future. So that's part of it. But then we're also going to have to do a lot of hard work within our societies to get those norms to actually agree, to have the political agreements for that to be in place. I think we have a very difficult discussion between Europe and the US around regulatory norms. GDPR is not perfect, but it provides us a process and a mechanism for basically having the transparency and the feedback loop with the private sector when they have, shall we say, a different alignment of interests and norms. We don't have that same feedback loop in the US, and we have to create it. And I guarantee there are going to be a lot of failures along the way, a lot more in the way of PRISM and Cambridge Analytica moments before we get there. And part of the challenge that I have and that Audrey has is that as we try and build that cross-cultural, multinational system, how do we avoid the loss in trust that's inevitable from undermining everything we've done? I want to throw that out there more as a moonshot challenge and something for us all to work on collectively. I don't have an easy answer to it.
Yeah, indeed. I totally do agree that in addition of being, nationalistic about our cultural service provision, we have this kind of common market issue. For example, to make it very easy to understand, let's imagine in Estonia, no, not imagine, we have actually one of these kind of, it's an arrow-directed service for people with a certain type of cancer. When they share their data, also their family history, they get free treatment. There is a practical application for that. So this is profiling, this is, telling you will probably have huge problems unless you take this medicine, the medicine's offered to you. It's relatively safe to do in Estonia because we have a single payer scheme who will never discriminate people, like your social tax in Estonia will not change if you have genes which might lead to these kind of outcomes. Whereas in countries where there is not a single payer scheme, but competition for more healthier patients going on between different insurers, the risks are in totally different category. How do we make sure that this all comes together? Johnny, you are more kind of international consultancy, so you cannot throw this to Luukas, but...
I was just about to.
He's got the NHS though.
Yeah, so. That's true. No, you are right. Like, I think on the incentives in the healthcare system, that's been a huge... there's a huge difference, and I think, frankly, that's why we have been able to drive so much more innovation in the NHS than I've been able to see in, or at least been able to make it stick, than I've been able to see in the Netherlands or in Germany that have those kind of two-tiered systems. So I completely agree with Lucas's point. Like these really big, difficult questions are just the same. They're the digital versions of really big, difficult political questions, right? So how do we cooperate on these things is the exact same fundamental questions about how do these democracies cooperate more broadly. Interesting thing about public procurement and the public sector market is that as a sort of market, it's the most unified market of anything other than maybe banking in Europe. The way public procurement works is exactly the same in Estonia as it is in the UK and as it is in Poland. And with some small differences, it's actually pretty similar as it works in Canada and the US and other places. But it is also one where international collaboration just doesn't happen anywhere near enough. We have this weird thing where it's very unified, but not collaborative enough. So I would love to see more Estonian companies in the UK and more UK companies in France. But I would also love to see the same problem-solving approaches across those places too.
Audrey, you have about a minute to tell us how you see this. Luukas mentioned this West against the rest question also in this kind of digital service provision. Would you also want to be part of this kind of common set of democratic limitations and standards, which we need to commonly apply, whatever our culture, but we have to make sure that even when services travel and companies offer internationally their services, that people will never fall into this kind of traps where their service quality will decrease because they've shared?
Yeah. Taiwan would be part of the GDPR adequacy if not for the fact that we have too many data protection authorities. As I mentioned, each ministry is one DPA. That's, I think, the only thing that we're still working out with the EU. Now, with that said, I think a plurality instead of a single unified vision fits best, in my view. And I will, if I only have a minute, simply read my job description, which is a prayer that I wrote in 2016 when I was visiting New Zealand. I learned I'm going to become the digital minister, which goes like this. When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it an Internet of Beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And whenever we hear that the singularity is near, let's always remember the plurality is here.
Thank you. That was a fantastic way to conclude our panel. Thank you all for your insights. We have no model solutions to propose, and of course there cannot be a single model because every state is a culture and cultural decisions will play the role. But this is not the reason to shy away from the responsibility of deciding, explaining and finally implementing database services in our society. Thank you all for listening in.
Thanks, guys. Thank you very much.